Imagine standing at the gates of Rome on a summer afternoon. There are no trumpets, no victory formations, no soldiers are cheering as they return from battle. Just dust and silence. This isn't the silence of a peaceful city. It's the silence of a place that's just been hit too hard to react right away. The Romans aren't crying. They aren't shouting. They aren't panicking. They're simply standing there, staring down the road that leads north from southern Italy, the road where a massive army was supposed to be coming home. But no one is coming back. Instead, small groups begin to appear in the distance. They aren't in formation. Shields are missing their straps. Armor is dented and bent. Many carry no weapons at all. They walk slowly, as if every step has to be reconsidered. This isn't an army. These are fragments of something that used to be one. Across the city, families begin to gather. They don't know who to ask. They don't know where to wait. In a few places, officials unroll unusually long scrolls, lists of names. So many names, far too many for a normal battle. People scan the lists, hoping to see a familiar name, and then fearing it that when they don't. Rome hasn't started crying yet, because Rome still doesn't fully understand what just happened, because what just happened wasn't a normal defeat. In the year 216 BC, on a field near a small village called Cannae, the Roman Republic lost almost an entire army in a single day. Not pushed back, not forced to retreat, but erased from the battlefield. Units that existed in the morning were simply gone by sunset. An army disappeared, not withdrawn, disappeared. To understand the shock of this, you have to understand how much Rome put on the table that day. At Cannae, Rome deployed the largest army it had ever committed to a single battle. Ancient sources estimate the force at over 80,000 men, heavy infantry, Italian allies cavalry, a mass of people large enough to crush almost any opponent if numbers alone decided the outcome. For the Romans, this wasn't just a battle. It was a statement, a declaration that every fear, every previous defeat, every humiliation could be wiped away with a single overwhelming blow. They didn't come to Cannae to outthink their enemy. They came to an end. But when the news made its way back to Rome, what slowly became clear wasn't the image of an army that had been beaten. It was the image of an army that had been trapped, compressed, and crushed, not by superior strength, but by its own size. Cannae wasn't the day Rome lost, because it was weak. Cannae was the day numbers became a prison. Rome's opponent that day was Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who had terrified the Italian peninsula for years. In Roman eyes, Hannibal was a threat that needed to be eliminated as quickly as possible, an invader to be smashed by overwhelming force to prove that Rome was still Rome. But Hannibal didn't come to Cannae to compare head counts. He didn't need to be stronger than Rome. He only needed Rome to do the one thing Rome trusted, above all else: advance concentrated strength and believe that nothing could stand against its weight. Hannibal understood something simple and incredibly dangerous. When an army is too large, too confident, and too determined to end everything in a single battle, that determination becomes a blindfold. They stop seeing the space around them closing in. They don't realize that every step forward is quietly sealing a door behind them. And the most terrifying part is this: the trap wasn't set in a forest or under the cover of darkness. There was no ambush, no surprise attack. Hannibal's trap was laid in broad daylight on an open field right in front of his enemy's eyes. Rome saw everything and walked straight into it anyway. If you've ever believed that having more men guarantees victory, hold on to that belief. Don't throw it away. Carry it with you through this story, because Cannae was designed to break that belief piece by piece. And if you're listening to this story from somewhere far, from southern Italy, leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Because the strange thing isn't what happened in 216 BC. It's that more than 2,000 years later, we're still coming back to this moment, still trying to understand how a republic that seemed impossible to break could be rendered silent in a single afternoon. Rome marched onto the field at Cannae with the confidence of a guaranteed winner, with the belief that enough men, enough shields, and enough discipline meant victory was only a matter of time. And it was at that exact moment, when Rome believed the battle was already decided, that Hannibal began to win. Later on, when Roman historians tried to explain why Cannae became such an overwhelming disaster, many of them focused on tactics, formations, or the genius of Hannibal himself. But if you want to understand why Rome truly lost at Cannae, you have to start much earlier with something far more human: humiliation. Rome wasn't just fighting a war. Rome was trying to erase the feeling of having been shamed. In the years leading up to Cannae, Hannibal had done the unthinkable. He defeated Roman armies on Italian soil, shattering the image of invincibility Rome had built over generations. Each defeat wasn't just a loss of men, it was a crack in the collective belief. And for a republic built on honor, reputation, and the projection of strength, those cracks were more dangerous than any spear. When a nation is humiliated, it no longer wants to win, it wants to punish. The atmosphere in Rome before Cannae wasn't one of cold calculation. It was a toxic mixture of fear and confidence. Fear because Hannibal was still out there moving freely across the Italian peninsula, defeating every army sent to stop him. And confidence because Rome still believed those defeats were accidents, that if they committed enough men, enough shields, enough discipline, reality itself would bend back into place. The Roman crowd didn't want to hear about long-term strategy. They didn't want patience. They didn't want a slow war of attrition. They wanted a decisive battle. One day, one blow, a clean ending. Hannibal needed to be crushed, and preferably in front of all Italy, so every other city-state would understand that siding with Rome was still the safest choice. That's when political pressure began to strangle military decision-making. In the Senate, politicians weren't just looking at maps. They were watching the eyes of their allies. They heard the whispers. If Rome couldn't protect itself, could it really protect anyone else? In a world where alliances were built on power, more than ideals, weakness spread like a disease. One city defecting today could pull 5 more away tomorrow. Rome understood that, and Rome feared it. So the range of choices narrowed not because of terrain or manpower, but because of expectations. Rome couldn't fight a small battle. Rome couldn't settle for a draw. Rome couldn't retreat without losing face. Rome had to win, and it had to win big, a victory loud enough to silence every doubt. But the problem was, this Rome wasn't a single person. Rome was a system, and at Cannae, that system had 2 heads. By Republican tradition, Rome elected 2 supreme commanders, each year 2 consuls, to share power and prevent any one man from becoming too powerful. In theory, it protected the Republic. On the battlefield, it could become a nightmare, because 2 men, 2 personalities, 2 philosophies of war were now expected to control a massive army as if they were a single mind. One believed in caution in avoiding battles that Hannibal could turn into traps. The other believed that hesitation only prolonged humiliation, that Rome needed a direct, crushing blow to end everything. And by law, supreme command rotated daily. Today belonged to one. Tomorrow belonged to the other. That was the seed of disaster, because an army cannot change its heartbeat every day and remain coherent. Soldiers didn't know whether tomorrow they would be ordered forward or told to hold back. Junior officers didn't know which orders truly represented Rome's will. And in that uncertainty, hesitation and recklessness began to intertwine. In that atmosphere, Rome did the one thing it believed could never be wrong. It gathered men, a lot of men. The army marching toward Cannae was unlike anything that had ever left Rome before. It wasn't just a fighting force. It looked like a moving city. Tens of thousands of men, shields brushing shields, spears held upright, dust rising in thick clouds under the southern Italian sun. Behind them stretched endless supply trains, carrying food, weapons, tools, and everything needed to sustain a massive human mass for days. As the formation moved, the ground trembled slightly. The sound of metal striking metal rolled like a steady drumbeat. To anyone watching from the outside, this was Roman power made physical. It felt as though nothing solid enough existed to stop that mass. No army was large enough to face it, no general bold enough to challenge it head on. Within those ranks was a centurion, a mid-level officer who had fought enough battles to no longer believe in heroic fantasies. And yet, looking around at the sea of shields, the forest of spears, and the faces set on moving forward, even he couldn't escape a deeply Roman thought. This time it's over. This time Hannibal will be taught a lesson he'll never forget. That feeling spread through the army like an electric current. This was no longer fear, it was anticipation. Anticipation of an ending, anticipation of revenge, anticipation of the moment when the world snapped back into its proper order, Rome above the enemy beneath its feet. But while Rome looked at its own mass and saw power on the other side of the field, Hannibal looked at that same mass and saw the shape of a mold large enough to cast a catastrophe. Rome believed it was carrying a hammer heavy enough to smash anything in its path. What it didn't realize was that Hannibal wasn't a nail. He was preparing the mold, and all he needed was for Rome to bring the hammer down in exactly the right place. If you were standing in the Roman ranks that day and looked across the field, you would probably think you were facing a weaker army, smaller, less uniform, lacking the imposing disciplined symmetry of Roman formations drawn up in perfect lines. In Roman eyes, this didn't look like a flawless war machine. It looked like a patchwork force, men following Hannibal for pay for hatred, or because they had nowhere else to go. And that is where the mistake began. Hannibal didn't play the muscle game. He never had. He knew perfectly well that he couldn't beat Rome by turning the battle into a contest of who had more men. But Hannibal understood something even more important. Rome didn't know how to fight any other way. Rome was trained to move straight ahead, to concentrate force, to trust that discipline and mass would crush anything in front of them. That wasn't just a tactic, it was an identity. Hannibal had watched Rome for years. He knew how they reacted to provocation. He knew how deeply they hated being challenged. And most importantly, he knew that when Rome believed it had the advantage, it wouldn't wait. It would advance, always advance. To Hannibal, that wasn't Rome's strength. It was a habit. And in war, habits are the easiest things to exploit. Hannibal's army at Cannae was not a single uniform body. It was a collection of different peoples, Iberians, Gauls, African infantry, and Numidian cavalry. Each group had its own weapons, its own fighting style, its own traditions. To Roman eyes, this looked like a weakness. A multi-ethnic army, lacking uniformity, could never match Roman legions, trained to the same rigid standard. But Hannibal didn't need uniformity of appearance. He needed unity of purpose. The real strength of this army wasn't in the center where Rome always focused its attention. It was on the flanks. There, Hannibal possessed what Rome lacked: highly mobile cavalry accustomed to striking fast, pulling back, and changing direction fluidly. And more importantly, these units were used to operate together under a single commander. No rotation, no arguments, no two heads on different days. Hannibal had no intention of winning the battle in the center. He intended to decide its fate from the sides. This is where popular history often gets Cannae wrong. It's usually told as a story of many versus few, of overwhelming genius, as if Hannibal simply outthought everyone else. That's convenient. The reality is far more uncomfortable. Cannae isn't a story about numbers. It's a story about space and timing. In ancient warfare, whoever controls space controls fate. Rome controlled manpower. Hannibal controlled how that manpower was placed in space. And that difference was everything. Hannibal didn't need to ambush Rome in a forest. He didn't need darkness or rough terrain. He needed a place wide enough to make Rome feel comfortable. A field where they could deploy their full strength and believe nothing stood in their way. Cannae was exactly that kind of place. To Hannibal, the battlefield wasn't a stage for fighting. It was a tool, a machine, and Rome was the raw material that would step into it on its own. He arranged his formation not to resist Rome's frontal punch, but to shape it. The center wasn't designed to hold forever. It was designed to give ground slowly, deliberately, like a door opening just enough to invite someone inside. The flanks, where the real work would be done, were held firm, ready to close when the moment came. There was no magic here, no mysterious trick. Just a very simple question Hannibal was asking Rome: if I give you what you want, most a sinner that is retreating, will you stop? And Hannibal already knew the answer. If you were a Roman commander standing in the front ranks that day, what would you see? You would see the enemy yielding ground. You would see them falling back under the pressure of Roman formations. You would hear cheers behind you, voices urging you forward, familiar phrases about victory being close at hand. There was no sign you were walking into a trap. In fact, everything looked exactly like the way Rome always won. That's what makes Cannae terrifying. There is no clear moment when you can say everything went wrong. No alarm bell, no flashing warning. Just a series of completely reasonable decisions, each one based on what Rome believed about itself. So ask yourself a very simple question. If you were Rome, if you had committed all of your strength to a single battle, if you saw your enemy retreating in front of you, what would you do? Would you stop and reconsider? Or would you press harder to finish everything right there? Hannibal knew the answer. He wagered the entire battle on the fact that Rome could not resist its own instincts. And that is why, when that day began, Hannibal wasn't worried about having fewer men. He only needed Rome to do what Rome always did. And Rome pressed harder, always did. Cannae wasn't a special place in the way battlefields are usually remembered. There were no towering cliffs, no narrow passes where a few hundred men could block an entire army. On the contrary, Cannae was an open space, a wide flat plain stretching along the banks of the Alphatus River, where the southern Italian sun beat down without obstruction. And precisely because of that, it was the perfect place for what was about to happen. For an army as large as Rome's, Cannae looked like paradise. There was enough room to deploy every man. No constraining terrain forces the formation to compress. No reason not to fight, the way Rome knew best. Concentrate force, drive straight ahead, crush the enemy's center, and finish the battle in a single morning. For Rome, this was the kind of battlefield they had won hundreds of times before. But to Hannibal, this field was not an arena. It was a chessboard. A wide plain meant space to move around the enemy. It gave cavalry room to accelerate, change direction, and swing behind the heavy Roman infantry. It also meant that once things started to move, there would be no walls, no forests, no hills to slow an army that was losing control. At Cannae, if a formation broke, it would break completely. The Alphatus River nearby wasn't a major obstacle, but it acted like an invisible boundary. Rome's supply lines ran through fixed routes, dusty roads used by baggage trains stretching 4 miles. Cannae wasn't just where two armies met. It was where every flowman food messages converged, and any disruption here would spread as fast as fire in dry grass. And then there was the wind, a detail very few Roman soldiers paid attention to as they formed up that morning. Southern Italy, in summer, has a familiar trait: hot winds sweeping across dry fields, lifting fine dust from the ground. Hannibal chose his position so that when the two armies faced each other, the wind would blow straight into the Roman lines. It wasn't decisive on its own, but it was insidious. Dust rose and clung to sweat-stung eyes, filled mouths. Visibility dropped. Orders had to be shouted louder. Hand signals became harder to see through the haze. No one in the Roman ranks believed the wind could decide the fate of a battle. But wars are rarely decided by one thing. They are decided by many small factors, each eroding order a little more until there is nothing left to hold on to. When the two armies deployed, the difference in mindset was immediately obvious. Rome formed up thick like a clenched fist. Heavy infantry was packed deep in the center, deeper than usual, accepting thinner flanks in exchange for maximum punching power. The idea was simple: drive straight into Hannibal's center, break it, and everything else would collapse automatically. This wasn't stupidity. This was how Rome had won countless battles before. But there was a cost to this arrangement. The denser the formation, the less flexible it became. A tightly packed mass could not easily change direction or respond quickly to threats on its sides. It was like a stone hurled with full force, incredibly powerful, but once thrown, it could only continue along its path. Across the field, Hannibal's formation looked entirely different. His center was not a straight wall. It bulged outward, curving toward the Romans, as if swelling to meet them. This part of the line was made up of troops Rome considered weaker men. They believed could not withstand sustained pressure. The flanks, which drew less attention, were held firm, anchored by the most mobile forces and ready to move. From above, Hannibal's formation looked like a door standing open, and Rome was charging straight toward the gap. The key thing to understand is that Hannibal never expected his center to hold forever. He didn't need it to win. He only needed it to last long enough. Long enough for Rome to commit fully. Long enough for the Roman formation to compress itself into a shape it could not escape. This was the moment when the trap began to take form, even if no one yet recognized it as such. By now, everything was effectively locked in, not by chains or stone walls, but by Rome's own perfectly reasonable decisions. The terrain was chosen, the formations were set, the wind was blowing the right way. There was very little left that could change without causing chaos. The machine had been fully assembled. All that remained was to turn it on. And then the first push began. Roman infantry advanced, without hesitation, without doubt. They moved the way they had been trained since they were recruits. Hold formation. Keep the rhythm drive forward. When the two lines collided, there was nothing cinematic about it. Just the sound of metal striking metal men shouting, and the familiar sensation that the enemy was giving ground, because Hannibal's center began to fall back. From Rome's perspective, this was the best possible sign. The enemy was buckling. The line was bending inward. The distance to victory seemed to shrink with every step. Soldiers in the rear saw nothing but the backs of their comrades ahead, and heard cheers ripple forward as the enemy retreated. The feeling was unmistakable. It felt like every Roman victory that had ever come before it. Like that moment just before the enemy line finally collapsed. The first push didn't just begin the battle. It carried something else with it. It felt like victory. The first push didn't just happen. It spread. As the Roman center pressed harder into Hannibal's front line, the sound of metal striking metal blended with cheers rising from the rear. This was a familiar sound, the sound of a battle unfolding exactly the way Rome expected it to. The enemy was giving ground. The distance was closing. The weight of the Roman formation was beginning to matter. The men in the front ranks could feel it clearly their pressure was working. And then Hannibal's center took another step back. From Rome's perspective, this was confirmation. This was the moment when words began to circulate, not as orders, but as belief. We're winning. They can't hold. Push. No one needed to command it. The formation advanced on its own. The momentum of tens of thousands of bodies began to function like a force of nature. Rome pressed harder. What Rome didn't realize was that Hannibal's center wasn't breaking. It was retreating in rhythm, ordered, controlled. There were no signs of panic, no sudden gaps that usually appear when a line is about to collapse. The units in the Carthaginian center fell back in short intervals, maintaining cohesion, preserving just enough spacing to avoid turning into a fleeing crowd. This wasn't a reaction. It was the plan. Hannibal wasn't waiting for Rome to arrive. He was pulling Rome in. Every step backward by the Carthaginian center was an invitation, one Rome couldn't refuse, because every Roman instinct said this was the decisive moment. This was when you commit everything. This was when hesitation allowed the enemy to recover. So Rome didn't hesitate. They fed more men into the center. Units in the rear were pushed forward, not because they were ordered to move, but because they had no alternative. When the front advanced, the rear had to follow. or the formation would tear itself apart from within. This is where the first micro-twist began. The farther Rome advanced, the less space remained. At the front, Roman soldiers no longer had room to adjust their footing. Shields pressed against shields, shoulders against shoulders. Spears could no longer be swung freely. They could only be driven straight ahead. Anyone who fell instantly became an obstacle, a choke point in the human flow compressing from behind. A centurion in the middle ranks, who had once believed this would be the day Hannibal was punished, suddenly noticed something small and terrifying. He tried to step left to avoid a fallen body in front of him and couldn't. Not because he was wounded, not because he was exhausted, but because there was no space. To his left was a comrade's shield, to his right another. Behind him, the constant pressure of men still advancing. He was still moving forward, but he was no longer free. It didn't feel like defeat. Not yet. It felt more like being trapped in an overcrowded lift, uncomfortable, but not alarming enough to provoke panic. And that was precisely what made it dangerous. No one shouted stop. No one thought this was the moment to change anything. As the dust thickened, visibility shrank. A soldier could see only the back in front of him and the helmet just above it. Hand signals from officers became meaningless. Orders had to be shouted, but voices were swallowed by the clash of metal, heavy breathing, and the cries of men shouting in pain or excitement. And then the second micro-twist emerged. The command system began to slip out of sync with reality. Junior officers no longer knew what was happening on the flanks. No one could see the whole field. No one knew whether the left wing was advancing or struggling. No one knew whether the right was holding or starting to bend. Each man knew only that the front was retreating and the rear was pushing. Under normal conditions, Rome handled situations like this well. But Cannae was not normal. The formation was too dense. The space is too compressed. Every small decision took time to travel. And time in moments like this was something Rome no longer had. Pause for a second and imagine it. Have you ever been in a crowd so dense you couldn't step back even a single pace? Now, add a heavy shield on your arm, a long spear in your hand, and a wall of people in front of you slowly retreating. You can't turn around. You can't change direction. You can only keep doing what the momentum of the crowd is forcing you to do. That feeling was beginning to spread through the Roman ranks, even if no one had a name for it yet. From a distance, looking down on the field of Cannae, the scene was deeply misleading. The Carthaginian center was being pushed back. Rome was advancing deep into the field. Everything looked like a victory taking shape. But inside that mass of men, order was being compressed, not broken, and that difference was lethal. Hannibal was getting exactly what he wanted. Rome was shaping itself into something he could manipulate. Every step forward was another lock clicking shut behind them. Every meter gained in the center was a meter of freedom lost on the flanks, but no one in the Roman army could feel that all at once. They felt it only in fragments, in small discomforts, in harder collisions, in moments that felt wrong, but not wrong enough. And so no one gave the order to stop. While Rome's attention was fixed on the retreating center, while the full weight of the army continued to pour into the funnel opening in front of them, something else was finishing almost unnoticed. On the flanks, where Rome was paying the least attention, the work was nearly done. While Rome was being drawn inward, the wings had already completed their task. If you were a Roman soldier standing in the center of the formation at this moment, you wouldn't notice anything unusual. You wouldn't hear warning cries. There would be no obvious sign that a disaster was taking shape, because Cannae didn't collapse from the center outward. It collapsed from the sides quietly. On one of Rome's flanks, where the line was thinner because so much weight had been packed into the center, pressure began to rise quickly. Hannibal's cavalry, faster, more flexible, accustomed to striking and pulling back, started to gain the advantage. This wasn't an immediate violent collision. It was more like a prolonged wrestling match, where each meter of ground was contested amid dust and the pounding of hooves. Then a small gap appeared. No one called it a collapse. Not yet. It was just a unit pushed back a little farther than expected. A line slipping out of alignment. A group of men forced to turn their shields to face pressure from the side instead of straight ahead. But in an army this large, a small gap is never just a small gap. It's a signal. Hannibal's cavalry recognized it instantly. They didn't plunge into the center the way Rome expected. They drove deeper into the weakness. They forced the Roman flank to compress, to face a direction it hadn't been prepared to fight. And once one flank began to wobble, the entire formation had to pay the price. This was the domino effect. To keep the center advancing, the opposite Roman flank had to strain harder. The line had to stretch, thinning itself even more to compensate for the imbalance. The soldiers there could feel the change immediately. Pressure increased. The spaces between units became dangerous. Orders began to contradict one another. Advance or hold, turn back, or keep pushing, but no one wanted to be the first to admit that something was wrong. From above, if you could see the whole field, the sight would be chilling. Rome's center was still advancing. It hadn't stopped, but both flanks were being bent inward, slowly, evenly, not by a single decisive blow, but by a series of small, precise movements, like fingers gradually curling closed. And then the decisive moment arrived. Hannibal gave the order. Not a dramatic command, not a shouted cry that shook the battlefield, just the familiar signal his cavalry units had been waiting for. Once the Roman center had pushed deep enough, once the formation was compressed enough to be difficult to turn, Hannibal allowed his wings to do what they did best. They turned. Hannibal's cavalry didn't keep pressing from the side. They pivoted, changed direction, and began moving behind the Roman formation. If you've never seen a maneuver like this in reality, imagine a blade cutting in one direction, then flipping its edge in the same motion. No extra force required, just a change of angle. For Rome, this was the moment reality began to slip away from expectation. At first, very few men realized what was happening. Those in the center were still being pushed forward. Those on the flanks were still trying to hold their ground, but then small signs appeared, subtle but impossible to ignore. Dust behind them was no longer settling. It was moving in the opposite direction. The sound of the battle changed. The clash of metal no longer came only from the front. There were cheers behind them, not Roman cheers, different ones, sharper, closer. A few soldiers turned instinctively, only to see shapes advancing from the direction they believed was safe. And in that instant, something deeply primal surfaced. Not the fear of death, but the fear of being trapped. You can endure defeat in front of you, but you cannot endure it when the door behind you disappears. This is when awareness began to spread not through orders, but through instinct. A soldier didn't need to be told that something had changed. He felt it in his body. Pressure no longer came from a single direction. Space already tight was becoming suffocating. In the center, men who were still advancing began to realize they were no longer moving into open ground. They were moving into something that was closing. Steps slowed not because of an order, but because there was no longer space to place a foot. Commands began to conflict, overlap, and then dissolve into noise. Cannae didn't collapse in an instant. It closed, one notch at a time. There was no trumpet calling for retreat, no final line to rally around. Only the unmistakable sensation that what had once been an advance had become an enclosed space. And inside that space, numbers the very thing Rome had once taken the greatest pride in, were turning into a burden. And then in a delayed, collective realization, Rome understood something terrifying. They were no longer moving forward. They were being locked in. The encirclement didn't close with a crash. It closed with a sensation, a feeling that was hard to name, spreading more slowly than a scream, but faster than any order. It was the moment a Roman soldier realized that the small gaps, the invisible paths he had always relied on, were gone. At the center, pressure now came from every direction at once. There was no longer a clear front or rear. Space shrank little by little, as if the battlefield itself were exhaling for the last time. The forward steps that had once felt like progress now became locks clicking shut. The funnel had done its work. The door was closed. For the man in the middle ranks, there was nothing dramatic about that moment. No alarm, no signal, just one very specific realization. He turned his head, on instinct, searching for the space behind him, the place that should have been there, if retreat were ever needed. But what he saw wasn't open ground. It was shields. Shields pressed against shields. Metal faces so close they could no longer be called behind. That centurion, the one who had believed this would be the day Hannibal was punished, stood still for a heartbeat longer than usual. Not out of fear, but because his mind was trying to process information that didn't fit his training. The enemy was in front of him. His comrades were behind him, but neither direction was a way out. That was the moment the perfect encirclement became a sealed room. Panic didn't erupt as it does in films. It didn't surge in a single wave. It seeped, one man at a time, one blocked movement, one failed attempt to turn. Each individual had his own private moment of realization that what he was experiencing wasn't a temporary crisis. It was a new condition. This is the paradox of Cannae. You panic, but you have nowhere to panic. You can't run because running requires space. You can't fall back because the space behind you is already filled. You can't turn left or right because both sides are packed with bodies under the same pressure. Every survival instinct is stopped by simple physics. And when instinct is locked down, the mind begins to fracture. Orders no longer function as orders. They become noise. Someone shouts, "Hold the line." Someone else yells, "Turn back." The sounds collide, overlap, and dissolve into the thick air of dust and ragged breathing. No chain of command can survive in a space where information cannot move faster than fear. In a perfect encirclement, even fear gets trapped. The men in the front ranks begin to feel the greatest strain, not because they are weaker, but because they are the contact surface for everyone behind them. Every push from the rear, however unconscious, transmits force forward. The men in the back have no intention of harming anyone. They are only trying to stay upright to find air to keep breathing. But in a mass compressed this tightly, every movement has consequences. The battle is no longer a contest of skill. It has become a problem of space. You can no longer swing a sword freely. There isn't room for your arm. The shield is no longer an active tool of defense. It becomes a surface that absorbs pressure. Every fallen body is not just one man removed from the fight, but a new obstacle, increasing the force on those still standing. This is how the grinder works, not through exceptional brutality, not through heroics or villainy, but through density, through tens of thousands of bodies forced into a space too small to function as an army. Here, the front ranks absorb everything, the rear ranks without meaning to become the driving force. No one controls this. No one orders it. It is the natural result of too many people trying to survive in a space that won't allow it. Try taking a deep breath. Now imagine you can't because your chest is pinned between the shield in front of you and the body behind you. Breath becomes a luxury. Each inhale is shallower than the last, and along with the air, the sense of order begins to fade. The centurion in the middle tries to keep control. He shouts familiar commands, not because he believes they will be heard, but because they are the last thing connecting him to the man he was before Cannae. His voice is swallowed. The faces around him are no longer looking toward him. They are fixed on the narrow space inches ahead where the back of another man used to be. At this point, no one is fighting in the conventional sense. They exist, standing, enduring, and with every passing minute that becomes harder. What makes Cannae so ruthless isn't the number of men who fall. It's the fact that a military system built on discipline, order, and faith in formation is shattered by the geometry of that formation itself. The dense ranks Rome's pride become the mechanism that locks them in place. Numbers, their greatest strength, become the thing that strips away freedom. This is the greatest mini-twist of the battle. The disaster isn't only the loss of life. It is the collective moment on the battlefield when Rome begins to understand that everything it believed about how it wins has been inverted, not by magic, not by betrayal, but by a cold truth under certain conditions. Numbers do not protect you. They destroy you. And once the encirclement is complete, once there is no longer a direction to advance or retreat, once the battlefield becomes a sealed space with no exits, Cannae is no longer a battle. It is a condition, one that no order can fix and no hero can reverse. But the most frightening part of Cannae does not lie here, not in the dust, the metal, or the sealed room where tens of thousands are trapped. The most frightening part begins afterward, because when the fighting ends and when the survivors turn their backs on this field, Cannae does not end in their minds. It follows them home. It reshapes how they think about war, about power, and about Rome itself. And that is where the real consequences begin. As the sun set over the field of Cannae, there was no great moment of celebration, no distant cheers rolling across the plain, only the heavy exhaustion of a battlefield that had just swallowed an entire generation. And while the survivors began to drift away from that place, the story of Cannae was only truly beginning somewhere else. It began in Rome. The city did not respond with panic, not immediately. Rome's first reaction was silence, an organized silence. The gates were secured more tightly. Emergency rites were performed. Prayers echoed through the temples. But beneath that familiar layer of order lay a very specific fear, the fear that Rome had just lost the most important thing it possessed, its credibility. Cannae didn't just kill men. It sent a message across Italy. If the largest Roman army ever fielded could be crushed in a single day, then what was holding the allies in place? What stopped them from looking at Hannibal and thinking that perhaps the future lay on the other side? Across the peninsula, city-states began to reconsider, not with dramatic announcements, but with hesitation, with delayed troop levies, with quiet listening. Rome felt it immediately, and Rome understood that this defeat was no longer confined to a battlefield. It was unfolding in the minds of those who had once believed in them. Among the trickle of men returning from Cannae were survivors, not many, but enough to carry the story home. One centurion, the man who had seen shields behind him, instead of an escape, eventually passed through the city gates. He carried no spoils, no pride. He carried something heavier, a fracture in belief. He had done everything Rome had taught him to do: hold the line, advance, trust the formation, and those very principles had led him into the sealed room at Cannae. Standing in the city, hearing others ask what happened, he didn't know how to answer, not because he lacked words, but because the truth was too difficult to accept. Rome did not lose because it was weak. Rome lost because it believed in itself too completely. And the strange thing is, Rome did not collapse under that realization. It changed. If you expect Cannae to have made Rome reckless, to have driven it toward an immediate revenge battle, you will be disappointed. Rome's response after Cannae was not explosive anger. It was a cold adjustment. They looked at what had happened and reached a painful conclusion. The way they liked to win was no longer safe. Rome began to abandon its obsession with quick, decisive battles. Instead, it chose endurance, attrition, avoiding confrontation when it wasn't necessary. It was accepted that war might last for years if that was the price of survival. Roman discipline did not vanish after Cannae. It hardened. It became less romantic, less proud, and far more ruthless toward its own instincts. Cannae did not kill Rome. It taught Rome how to become harder to kill. Meanwhile, on the other side, Hannibal stood before a historical paradox. He had achieved one of the most perfect battlefield victories ancient warfare would ever produce. A victory that generals would study for thousands of years. A victory any commander would dream of. And yet the war did not end. Rome did not collapse. The city did not open its gates and surrender. New legions were raised. Allies, though shaken, did not abandon Rome outright. Hannibal had won the battle exactly as he intended, but he could not force Rome to accept the ending he needed. This is the great paradox of Cannae. Winning a day is not the same as winning a war. Hannibal destroyed an army, but he did not destroy the system capable of producing the next one. And over time, that system, tempered by the trauma of Cannae, would become even more dangerous to him. We tend to prefer martyrdom stories. They are clean, easy to tell, easy to love. A small group stands firm, dies beautifully, and never has to confront the consequences of victory. But history rarely works that way. History is more often written by ugly victories, unheroic decisions, and bitter lessons no one wants to learn. Cannae is one of those moments. There are no perfect heroes here. No sidewalks away with clean hands. Only a republic forced to grow up by confronting the truth that its power had limits and that its pride could be turned into a weapon against itself. Cannae is not the story of Rome's end. It is the story of why Rome became the Rome we recognize later, a power that not only knew how to win, but also knew how to learn from its worst defeats. If you've made it this far, you're a true history enthusiast. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. Please verify your subscription. If you haven't, it genuinely helps the channel. Continue telling historical stories that aren't clean, aren't simple, but are honest. And if you want to know what happens next, check out the next video on your screen. After Cannae, how did Rome strike back? And what opportunity did Hannibal miss? One that might have changed the course of Western history forever. I'll see you there.